December 11th, 1971, Westminster, Colorado, a suburb of Denver. In the living room of a man named David Nolan, approximately a dozen people have gathered. Nolan is a libertarian writer and activist. He has a typewriter, a copy of Atlas Shrugged, a subscription to Reason magazine in its first decade of publication, and the conviction, shared by every person in the room, that the political vehicles available to them in the United States of America in 1971 will not defend liberty. Among the dozen are Nolan's then-wife Susan, John Hospers, a philosophy professor down from the University of Southern California, whose 1971 book, Libertarianism, A Political Philosophy for Tomorrow, has just appeared in print, and a journalist from Eugene, Oregon, Theodora Nathan, known to her friends as Tony. They have come together because 4 months earlier, on August 15th, 1971, the President of the United States closed the gold window. He imposed wage and price controls, and he added a 10% surcharge to imports. Earlier that year, in an interview with the broadcaster Howard K. Smith, the same president had reportedly remarked, "I am now a Keynesian in economics." The president was Richard Nixon, a Republican. In the living room in Westminster, the dozen people vote to form a new political party. Within weeks, they will draft a statement of principles. In June of the following year, they will hold their first national convention in Denver and nominate Hospers and Nathan as their first presidential ticket. The ticket will appear on the ballot in 2 states. It will receive fewer than 4,000 votes nationwide, and by any conventional electoral measure, the campaign will be negligible. It will not be negligible, however, in the manner that mattered. That is the founding scene of the Libertarian Party of the United States. 55 years later, in just a couple of weeks from now, somewhere around 1,000 delegates will gather in Grand Rapids, Michigan, to conduct business and elect officers for the same party that began in that living room. This 3-part feature exists to ask what should happen there, what is likely to happen there, and what either outcome will mean. The first piece, today, cannot begin at the convention. It has to begin at a distance from the convention with the most basic question of all. What is being claimed, and by whom, when someone uses the word libertarian?
Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This episode is a special one. It's not part of the Empire of Liberty series we've been building over the past several months. It is for the libertarian curious, for those disaffected by current political parties and trying to understand what this particular third party is made of. And what do folks who call themselves little L libertarian mean by that? It's the first part of a 3-part feature running across the next 2 weeks and into the convention itself on libertarianism and the 2026 Libertarian National Convention. 3 pieces over 3 weeks leading up to and through Grand Rapids. Today is the foundation. The second piece next week will examine the contemporary factions of the Libertarian Party and the specific tests the convention will pose to each. The third piece, scheduled for the day the convention adjourns, will report directly from the floor. The work the present episode has to put on the table is a standard to separate with care the libertarianism idea, the lowercase l, from the Libertarian Party, the capital L. Because if those two things are not held distinct in the listener's mind, the next two pieces will just read as a conventional partisan accounting, and they will miss what is actually being measured. So let us begin. Last fall, as part of this larger project on consequentialactions.com, we ran a short, written-only series called Parties, Ideologies, and Systems. The central analytic move of that series was to separate three things that American political vocabulary habitually confuses. One is parties. Parties are coalitions. They're shifting electoral combinations of interest groups, factions, and pragmatists, held together by the prospect of winning elections. Ideologies are coherent belief systems, structured commitments about human nature, the moral status of force, the source of legitimate authority, and the proper scope of government. And systems. Systems are structural arrangements. Capitalism, socialism, mercantilism, institutional forms that can be defended on incompatible grounds. Most of what passes for political argument in America fails because the parties to the argument are using a single label to mean two or three different things at once. Liberal is exactly that kind of word. Conservative is exactly that kind of word. Progressive, populist, moderate, every one of them. And yes, libertarian is exactly that kind of word. Now, written with a lowercase l, the word libertarian names an ideology. That ideology and the tradition of its antecedents from which it draws are older than the United States, older than the Enlightenment that produced the United States, older than the modern English language itself in which we now use the word. It is a coherent set of commitments about self-ownership, about the use of force, about the source of governmental authority, about the conditions under which obligation can be morally binding, drawn from a tradition articulated and refined across roughly 25 centuries. With a capital L, the word libertarian names a coalition. That coalition, as we just heard, was organized at a meeting on December 11th, 1971 in the living room of David Nolan in Westminster, Colorado, in immediate response to a specific economic and political crisis. It has continued in unbroken legal existence since. But it has not been the same coalition continuously. It has migrated across the ideological map back and forth at least 3 times in 55 years. And it may be migrating again as we speak. The tradition the lowercase l now names predates the capital L by approximately 2,400 years. The capital L predates this episode by less than 3 generations. And that is the foundation for everything that follows in this episode and in the 2 pieces that come after. The relationship between the two is the relationship between a tradition and an institution, between a body of thought and one organizational vessel that has, for some portion of its history, attempted to carry that body of thought into electoral politics. The tradition does not depend on the institution. The institution depends on the tradition. When the institution is well aligned with the tradition, it does honor to the name. And when it is not, well, the meaning is less. Much of the political illiteracy that surrounds the word libertarian arises from a failure to keep these 2 things separate. Critics of the Libertarian Party are routinely treated by their opponents as if they were critics of libertarianism, the ideology, as though the institutional choices of an organization in the 2020s could somehow reach back and refute the philosophical claims advanced by John Locke in 1689 or Frederick Bastiat in 1850. And defenders of the Libertarian Party, similarly, sometimes lean on the philosophical heritage of the lowercase-l as though it were a guarantee of the moral standing of the capital L, as though the lineage from Cicero to Rothbard had somehow vested in this particular incorporated entity in 1971 and could not be compromised since. Both moves are mistakes, and the remainder of this episode exists to keep the adjective and the noun separate. The libertarian idea, reduced to its core commitments, can be stated in a single page. The philosophy is not complicated. Its complications arise when it is met with the friction of the real world. The foundation itself is self-ownership. Each individual owns himself or herself, not as a matter of political preference, as a matter that precedes politics altogether. The body, the labor, the choices, the moral life, these belong to the person who lives them. They do not belong to a clan. They do not belong to a state. They do not belong to a majority that happens to have prevailed in a recent election. And to argue otherwise is to revive a position that mankind spent several thousand years escaping. A position the libertarian rejects on principle, and one that few moral philosophers in the modern era have been willing to defend in plain language. From self-ownership comes the non-aggression principle. The initiation of force against another person or against another person's legitimately held property is the basic moral wrong from which most political crimes descend. Murder, assault, theft, fraud, kidnapping, rape. These are not wrong because a statute names them so, but because they violate something prior. The statute is recognizing a moral fact. It is not creating one. And statutes that authorize aggression, and many do when the aggression is conducted under official letterhead, do not transform the moral status of the act. They license it. They conceal it under a uniform. They give it dignity of a procedure, but they do not change what it is. If aggression is the basic wrong, then human cooperation, to be morally legitimate, must rely on something else. The libertarian's answer is consent. Trade, contract, association, marriage, employment, religious community, every form of human cooperation under which civilization has actually flourished is built upon voluntary exchange. Each party judges that the exchange improves their position. If either party did not so judge, the exchange would not occur. The aggregate result of countless voluntary exchanges is the wealth, the cultural achievement, and the social order we inherit and pass on. And the aggregate result of countless coerced exchanges is what civilization has spent its better moments trying to escape. These two commitments together, self-ownership and the non-aggression principle, produce the libertarian view of government. Government is not a parent. It is not a partner. It is not the source of rights. It is, on the libertarian account, a derivative agent, an institution that exists where it legitimately exists at all, only because individuals possessing prior rights have delegated certain narrowly defined functions to it. And because individuals cannot delegate authority they do not themselves possess, government cannot rightly do what an individual could not rightly do. This is not a slogan. It's a logical proposition. A delegated agent's authority cannot exceed the authority of the principal. If a man does not have the authority to take his neighbor's property by force, he cannot vest that authority in an agent. If 10 men do not have it, 10 million voters do not have it either. Numbers do not create rights. Adding a ballot box to 10,000 individual acts of thefts does not change the moral status of the underlying act. Apply this in 3 steps, and it becomes what we call the liberty test. First, ask whether an individual could morally do this thing to another individual. If the answer is yes, the act is permissible, and the question of who performs it becomes secondary. If the answer is no, ask whether some group of individuals could delegate this power to government. The libertarians' answer is that they could not. The delegation is mathematically impossible. A power no individual possesses cannot be transferred to an agent merely by aggregating individuals who do not possess it. 0 times anything remains 0. Therefore, the act remains aggression, regardless of who performs it. A badge does not transform the act. Neither does a robe, a uniform, a majority vote, or an official title. This recurring framework, sometimes summarized in the phrase, fancy hat and larger mobs do not change ethics, will run throughout the upcoming series Self-Evident, The Road to 1776, premiering this summer. That series will trace how thinkers from Cicero through Locke through Jefferson worked out the same insight in their own languages and in their own time. Well, let me take this out of the abstract for a moment. Personally, I am sometimes asked about my position on taxation, specifically on confiscatory taxes, taxes on production, taxes on the fruits of someone else's labor. My answer is that taxation in those forms is theft. And the reaction I usually get to that statement tells me whether the person I am talking to has thought about the question for 10 minutes or 10 years. My own position has evolved over my life. It began, I will admit, with the empirical case. When you tax production, people produce less. We've seen it, the Laffer curve, supply side economics. When you tax performance, you get less performance. As a child of the 80s and the Cold War, I understood what Margaret Thatcher said, what Ronald Reagan said, and what the Soviets were learning. The disincentive is real. The studies confirm it. The economic record across decades and across countries confirms it. There's also a related effect, less often discussed, on private charity. When people assume that the social safety net is funded by the tax dollars they already pay, their willingness to give privately declines. They have, in their own minds, already given. The tax has crowded out the charity. And that, too, is documented. But my objection runs deeper than the empirical case. The empirical case is a consequentialist case. Taxation produces bad outcomes, therefore taxation is bad. And a consequentialist case can always, in principle, be answered by another consequentialist case. The deeper objection is the one we just laid out before. If I, as an individual, cannot rightly take $20 out of your wallet, then no individuals I organize, no committee, no convention, no electorate, no parliament can rightly do it on my behalf. Even if I am taking the money for a cause I sincerely believe to be good, even if that cause does some good to the world, the cause being good does not transform the act of taking. And this is the part of the argument that always seems to land last. Who is to say that my judgment of which causes are good are any more relevant, more morally authoritative than yours? Why does the existence of a vote or a procedure or a uniform on the person collecting the money give my judgment power over yours? It does not. That is the libertarian answer. The badge does not transform the act. The vote does not transform the act. The procedure does not transform the act. 10,000 individual takings organized into a procedure are still 10,000 takings. And it's not an empirical claim. It is a moral one. and is the same moral claim the liberty test states in 3 steps. If government is a derivative agent, the libertarian skepticism of power follows naturally. Lord Acton's observation that power tends to corrupt was not a warning to bad people, it was a warning to good people. The libertarian assumes those who acquire power are no better and no worse on average than those who do not. And thus we design institutions on the working assumption that the worst person could possibly fill an office will fill it eventually. Think about if you're a listener that is a Republican or a Democrat, a team red or a team blue, in some form, you believe over the last 8 years, the worst person who could possibly fill an office has filled it in the office of the presidency. If you're a staunch Democrat, a team blue supporter, you believe Donald Trump is the worst president that could ever fill that office. And if you're a team red, a Republican, you believe that Joe Biden was the worst president that could have filled that office. Libertarians say that's possible. And therefore, the institution itself must be constructed to fail safely under that condition for any office. And from this skepticism of central authority comes libertarian respect for spontaneous order. The world is too complicated to be designed and run by a planner. The knowledge required to govern productively is distributed across millions of minds, none of which could, in principle, hold it all at once. F.A. Hayek's argument in the 1945 essay, The Use of Knowledge in Society, is that the price system is, among other things, an information system. It is the canonical statement of the case. Languages, common law, scientific norms, custom of trade, these things were built by no one in particular and govern the lives of millions. They cannot be replicated by committee. They cannot be replicated by AI. They certainly cannot be replicated and replaced by a committee without catastrophic loss. And finally, methodological individualism. Society is not an organism. It is not a tribe. It is not a class. Society is the lives of individual men and women. Individual men and women who conduct in cooperation with one another. There's no national interest separate from the interests of individuals who comprise the nation. There's no general will separate from the wills of the actual individuals who hold them. Aggregations are tools of analysis. They are not moral agents. The morally relevant unit is the individual. The morally relevant question is whether individuals are more free or more governed. Those are the basics. Self-ownership, the non-aggression principle, voluntary exchange, government as a derivative agent, the liberty test, skepticism of power, spontaneous order, and methodological individualism. From these, every recognizable libertarian position is derived. Free trade and the suspicion of tariffs, sound money and the critique of central banking, free movement as a matter of free contract, free speech as a matter of self-ownership extended to thought and expression, free association as a matter of freedom from compelled cooperation. And yes, as we've talked about in Empire of Liberty, the suspicion of standing armies and entangling alliances, the rejection of taxation as anything other than a coercive transfer, the commitment to peaceful coexistence with peoples whose lives are not ours to direct. Within the natural rights strand of the tradition, reasonable libertarians disagree on the application. They do not disagree on the foundation. The libertarian idea is sometimes treated by its critics and occasionally by its proponents as an American novelty. It is not. Its origins are far older than the American founding, and its development has run through many hands and many centuries. What follows is a sketch of the Self-Evident series beginning this summer, where we will treat each of these moments in depth across 22 articles. For present purposes of this feature, what matters is that the lowercase l is a tradition. It begins, for our purposes, with Cicero and the Stoics. The Roman orator and constitutionalist Marcus Tullius Cicero, Tully, writing in the 1st century before Christ, articulated the doctrine of natural law, that there is a higher standard of justice that exists independently of any positive enactment, and by which positive enactments must themselves be measured. The Stoic tradition, on which Cicero drew the universality of human reason and the cosmopolitan unity of the human race under that reason. Cicero died for the republic he served. He was killed on the orders of Mark Antony, his head and hands afterward displayed on the rostra from which he had spoken against him. He died in the most literal sense, defending the proposition that there is a higher law than the will of a man with an army. In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas integrated Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology and produced the most sophisticated medieval treatment of natural law. The Thomas position that human reason can discern principles of justice that bind the conscience independently of the commands of any earthly ruler supplied the moral grammar by which later thinkers would defend the proposition that an unjust command is no law at all. The school of Salamanca in 16th century Spain would carry this tradition forward, pioneering arguments about subjective rights, the limits of conquest, and the foundations of property, which Hugo Grotius and John Locke would inherit a century later. In 1215, English barons compelled King John to sign the Magna Carta, limiting royal authority and establishing certain procedural protections, the seed 4 centuries before its full flowering of due process. The 17th century English civil wars produced the Levellers, John Lilburne, Richard Overton, William Walwyn, who argued in pamphlets and at the Putney debates of 1647 for popular sovereignty, religious toleration, and an end to legal privilege based on station and a written constitution. They lost in their immediate political moment, but they won across centuries. Their language and their arguments were absorbed by the Whig tradition that produced the Glorious Revolution and the American Revolution a century after that. John Locke's 2 treatises of government, published in 1689 in the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution, became the most influential single statement of natural rights argument in English. The state of nature, the law of nature, the rights of life and liberty and property, the social contract, the right of revolution against tyranny. This is the language the American founders would use because it is the language Locke had given them. Algernon Sidney, executed in 1683 for the manuscript of his Discourses Concerning Government, taught that resistance to tyranny was not merely a right, but a duty. The 18th century Commonwealth men, Trenchard and Gordon's Cato's Letters, the writings of Bolingbroke, the historical and constitutional works of James Berg provided the immediate revolutionary vocabulary the American colonists deployed in the 1760s and 1770s. The American founding is itself a chapter in this lineage, not its origin. Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence, was, as he wrote near the end of his life, expressing the harmonizing statements of the day rather than offering new philosophy. James Madison drafted much of the Constitution from the libraries of ancient and modern confederacies that Jefferson had shipped to him from Paris. George Mason, drafting the Virginia Declaration of Rights in June 1776, gave Jefferson much of the language of unalienable rights that would appear in the Declaration 3 weeks later. And the Anti-Federalists, particularly the writers using the pseudonyms Brutus and Federal Farmer, supplied the most penetrating critique of the proposed Constitution, warning that its powers would consolidate in the central government and produce, eventually, the very tyranny the Revolution had been fought to escape. the Bill of Rights was, in considerable measure, the Federalist concession to those warnings. In the 19th century, the lineage largely moved to Europe. Frederick Bastiat, writing in France in the years before his death in 1850, produced the law, the most accessible single statement of the libertarian view of legitimate government ever written. Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America warned with particular acuity about the tendency of democratic states towards soft despotism and administrative centralization. Herbert Spencer, in The Man versus the State in 1884, produced one of the late 19th century sharpest critiques of the new collectivist tendency rising on both sides of the Atlantic. And the 20th century revival of the tradition was led in considerable measure by economists working in or descended from the Austrian school. Ludwig von Mises, writing in Vienna and later in New York, produced Socialism in 1922, Liberalism in 1927, and Human Action in 1949. Between them, those three books constituted the most rigorous defense of the market economy and the most penetrating critique of central planning the century would produce. Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom in 1944 brought the Austrian critique of economic planning to a popular audience. His Constitution of Liberty in 1960 gave the most sophisticated mid-century philosophical defense of the free society. Murray Rothbard, working in the second half of the century, drew the implications of the Austrian and natural law traditions to their logical conclusion in For a New Liberty in 1973 and The Ethics of Liberty in 1982. He built, through the Mises Institution and many of his students, the institutional infrastructure of the late 20th century and American libertarianism. From outside the strict Austrian tradition, two other 20th century figures shaped the public reception of the libertarian idea. Milton Friedman made the case for free markets at Chicago, and in books like Capitalism and Freedom in 1962 and Free to Choose in 1980, of which he did a television series. His record on policy detail, however, particularly the wartime designs of the income tax withholding, earned him a sharp and well-deserved criticism within the broader tradition. Robert Nozick, the Harvard philosopher whose Anarchy, State, and Utopia in 1974 was a direct response to John Rawls, produced the most influential modern academic defense of the minimal state. Friedman expanded the audience, and Nozick legitimized the position within the academy. And in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the public face of American libertarianism has been more than any other person, Dr. Ron Paul of Texas, a physician, a 12-term member of the House of Representatives, and twice the Republican primary candidate whose presidential campaigns brought a generation of young Americans to the works of Mises, Rothbard, and Hayek. Hans Hermann Hoppe, working at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, has extended the Rothbardian tradition into argumentation, ethics, and the analysis of democracy as a system of public ownership of the state. Beneath those names, a wider movement, Lou Rockwell, Tom Woods, Scott Horton, Jeff Deese, Judge Andrew Napolitano, Dave Smith, Michael Malice, and dozens of others working through the Mises Institute, the Libertarian Institute, Antiwar.com, the Cato Institute, the Reason Foundation, and thousands of independent voices on platforms have replaced the legacy media. The lineage is unbroken. It is also alive. Very much so. A tradition that has lasted 25 centuries does not lack internal disagreement, however. And there are 5 live conversations within libertarianism that are worth flagging here, because each of them will recur in the second piece of this feature. And the point of flagging them now is to establish they are arguments inside a shared frame. They're not arguments about whether that frame should be honored at all. There is the minarchist-anarchist conversation. Some libertarians believe the legitimate scope of government, while strictly limited, is non-zero. Others, the anarcho-capitalists, of whom Murray Rothbard was the most influential expositor, argue that even minimal state functions can, in principle, be supplied by competing private institutions. Within the Libertarian Party, the famous Dallas Accord of 1974 was a working compromise. The platform would not formally take a position of whether the legitimate state was minimal or zero, leaving both positions welcome under the party tent. Then there's the thick versus thin argument. The thin libertarian holds that libertarianism is exhausted by its political claims and is silent on culture, family, and social attitude. The thick libertarian holds that libertarianism either entails or naturally accompanies further commitments, commitments which, depending on the school, point in opposite cultural directions. There's a closely related but distinct paleo-libertarian versus cosmopolitan argument. Whether libertarianism is best paired with cultural conservatism and traditional family structures, or with cosmopolitanism, secularism, and explicit rejection of inherited cultural forms. There is the pragmatist versus doctrinaire argument, which arises in any movement that engages electoral politics. The pragmatist holds that the politics is the art of the possible. The doctrinaire holds that the doctrine is the point. And this argument has been rehearsed at every Libertarian Party convention since 1972, and most certainly will be rehearsed again in Grand Rapids. And then there's the immigration question. The libertarian commitment to free movement and free contract has been read by some, Brian Kaplan most prominently, as entailing open borders. The libertarian commitment to private property rights has been read by others, Hans Hermann Hoppe most prominently, as entailing that mass migration into territory whose public spaces and welfare apparatus are not voluntarily owned constitutes a form of coerced association at the expense of the actual rightful claimants. Both positions appeal to recognizably libertarian first principles. They reach different conclusions about how those principles apply when the territorial state is the thing whose policies are at issue. These are the live conversations. They are not the boundaries of the tradition. They are arguments inside the tradition. The second piece next week will examine how those conversations have crystallized into specific factions within the Libertarian Party itself and how those factions are likely to be tested at Grand Rapids. For the moment, what matters is the framing. A vigorous internal conversation is a sign of life, not of incoherence. A tradition that does not argue with itself has stopped thinking. The lowercase-l has not stopped thinking. So that transitions us to the noun. Return for a moment to that living room in Westminster, Colorado in December 1971. What had happened 4 months earlier was the Nixon Shock. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon announced from the Oval Office a package of measures that would have been recognized in any prior generation as a confession that the post-war Bretton Woods monetary order had failed. He closed the gold window, severing the last link between American currency and any physical store of value. He imposed a 90-day freeze on wages and prices. He imposed a 10% surcharge on imports. The combination amounted to the most aggressive peacetime intervention in the American economy since the New Deal. And earlier that year, in an interview with Howard K. Smith, the same president had reportedly said, "I am now a Keynesian on economics." A self-styled fiscal conservative and Republican president had openly disclosed that, in a matter of money and economic management, he had abandoned the position the Republican Party had nominally claimed for half a century, and instead embraced the position the chief intellectual architect of the post-war managed economy. For libertarians, the August intervention was not a surprise. It was predicted consequence of a confession that had already been made. In the months that followed, conversations among free market activists, Goldwater veterans, objectivists, Messians, constitutionalists, and refugees from the 1969 split of Young Americans for Freedom converged on a single conclusion. The Republican Party was not going to defend liberty. The Democratic Party had abandoned the pretense decades earlier. If liberty was going to have an organized political voice in American electoral life, it was going to need a vehicle of its own. That vehicle, in its first form, was constructed in Nolan's living room in December 1971. Within weeks of the founding meeting, the new party had drafted a statement of principles which, with some modifications, remains the philosophical foundation of the party to this day. The first national convention was held in Denver in June 1972. The Hosper's Nathan ticket appeared on the ballot in 2 states. They received fewer than 4,000 votes. But on December 18, 1972, something happened that mattered. A Republican presidential elector from Virginia named Roger McBride pledged to cast his electoral vote for the Nixon-Agnew ticket, declined to do so. He cast his electoral vote instead for Hospers and Nathan. That decision made Tony Nathan the first woman in American history to receive an electoral vote, 12 years before Geraldine Ferraro became the first woman nominated for vice president on a major party ticket, and 48 years before Kamala Harris was elected vice president. It was also the first electoral vote ever for the Libertarian Party ticket. McBride himself would become the Libertarian Party's presidential nominee in 1976 and receive 173,000 votes, a 40-fold increase over the 1972 ticket. The institutional fact of the party was real. It would persist beyond its founding moment. The party was not founded in good times. It was not founded by people seeking a comfortable expression of an established consensus. It was founded by people who looked at the dominant political vehicles of 1971, the Republican Party that had just confessed itself Keynesian, and the Democratic Party that had just spent 40 years building the architecture Nixon was, in his own way, ratifying, and concluded that the libertarian idea no longer had a home in either place. The capital L in its first form was the institutional refusal to be Keynesian. It was the dissent given organizational shape. This is what should be remembered when its later forms are examined. What the party has been since that founding moment is a more complicated story. A compressed history, then. The forensic version belongs to next week. The first decade of the party, 1971 through 1979, was an extended argument about who the party was. The 1974 Dallas Accord ratified the working compromise that minarchists and anarchists could coexist within the same tent, provided the platform itself remained agnostic. Then in 1980, Ed Clark's campaign, with David Koch as his running mate and substantial Koch family financial support, received 921,128 votes, approximately 1.06% of the national total. That figure stood as the party's high watermark for 36 years. The Clark campaign also exposed the first internal fault line. Clark's relatively moderate, mainstream-friendly positioning drew sharp criticism from the doctrinaire wing, Murray Rothbard most prominently, who would shortly thereafter leave the LP altogether for several years. And then in 1984, the Berglund campaign produced 228,000 votes, a steep retreat from the Clark high. Then, in 1988, Ron Paul, at that point a former 3-term Republican congressman who had broken with his party over its abandonment of fiscal restraint, sought the Libertarian Party nomination and won it on the first ballot. The Paul ticket received 432,000 votes nationally. More importantly, the 1988 campaign began the long process by which Ron Paul would become the most consequential public face of the libertarian idea in American life, though most of that influence after 1988 would be exercised from within the Republican Party rather than the Libertarian Party. The 1996 and 2000 nominations of Harry Browne are remembered as a period of unusual philosophical clarity. Browne ran on a doctrinaire platform: abolition of the income tax, withdrawal from foreign entanglements, end of the drug war, restoration of sound money. His vote totals were modest in raw numbers, but his speeches, debates, and books offered the most coherent statement of the libertarian position any major LP candidate would deliver until Ron Paul's Republican campaigns in 2008 and 2012. The 2000s and 2010s brought a deliberate strategic shift toward broader appeal. The 2008 nomination of former Republican Congressman Bob Barr, the 2012 nomination of former Republican Governor Gary Johnson. The strategic question, whether the party should optimize for raw vote totals or for ideological coherence, had been answered, at least at the convention level, in the favor of those vote totals. And that answer reached its peak in 2016. Johnson and Bill Weld received 4.4 million votes, 3.28% of the national ticket, more than triple the Ed Clark high, the largest Libertarian Party vote in absolute and percentage terms in the party's history. It was simultaneously the most ideologically diluted presentation the party had ever offered. Johnson struggled visibly with foreign policy questions. Weld, in the campaign's closing week, effectively endorsed Hillary Clinton. The platform-level concessions made to attract major party defectors drew sustained criticism from the doctrinaire wing. That same year produced the party's electoral peak, produced its sharpest internal crisis of identity. Both the peak and the crisis were the same event. In the immediate aftermath of 2016, a new caucus formed within the Libertarian Party. It was called the Mises Caucus. It was associated with the Mises Institute, the Tom Woods podcast audience, the Ron Paul movement remnant, and the broader paleo-libertarian tradition. Its explicit purpose was to recapture the institutional party for what its members regarded as its founding doctrinal commitments. In May 2022, at the LP National Convention in Reno, Nevada, the Mises Caucus succeeded. Angela McArdle was installed as chair. Most other party officer positions were swept. The platform was substantially rewritten, most notably by removing language on social issues that the caucus regarded as departures from libertarian first principles, and by rewriting the immigration plank in a more restrictionist direction. The takeover was decisive at the convention level. It was also fiercely contested by what is variously called the Classical Liberal Caucus, the Pragmatic Caucus, or simply the Legacy LP. The 2024 National Convention in Washington, D.C. produced the nomination of Chase Oliver, a candidate the Mises Caucus leadership had not endorsed. The convention floor revealed that the 2022 takeover had not produced a unified caucus control of the party's nominating process. Oliver received approximately 650,000 votes in the November general election, well below the Johnson-Weld peak in raw numbers and well below most of Brown's totals in percentage terms. The 2024 cycle is read by different observers as evidence of different things. Some see it as the failure of the Mises Caucus to consolidate its 2022 gains. Others see it as the failure of the legacy and pragmatist wings to articulate an alternative. Both readings have merit, and the fuller assessment belongs to next week. And that brings us to Grand Rapids. May 21st through May 25th, 2026, at the Amway Grand Plaza and DeVos Place complex on the Grand River. Officer elections, platform debate, and procedural decisions will be made there, will shape the institutional party for at least the following 2-year cycle, and probably longer. What is to be expected, what is at stake, and what tests will reveal which faction is in the ascendant, those questions belong to the second piece of this feature. But the standard against which any of those tests would be measured, the standard against which any institutional choice is to be evaluated, that standard is still the work of today's piece. So return now to where we began. The libertarian idea, the lowercase l, is older than the United States, older than the Enlightenment, older than the modern English language in which we now use the word. It will be older still when the present generation has passed. Its survival does not depend on the survival of the Libertarian Party. The party can flourish, dissolve, recapture itself, fragment, or persist as a marginal vehicle for expression for a contracting subculture. The idea will remain what it is, independently of that history. Cicero is not less correct because Grand Rapids goes one way rather than another. Bastiat is not less correct. Locke is not less correct. The liberty test is the liberty test whether anyone in particular passes it. The Libertarian Party, the capital L, is one institutional expression of the idea. It's not the only one. The Mises Institute is another. The Libertarian Institute is another. Antiwar.com is another. The Cato Institute, in its sounder moments, is another. The Reason Foundation, in its more libertarian moods, is another. And the Ron Paul Institute is another. The dozens of independent voices, podcasters, Substack writers, working scholars, working journalists, operating outside any institutional shelter, they are also another. The Libertarian Party, when it functions well, is the electoral expression of an idea that has many other channels of expression. Its value is not given. It is a function of whether it serves the idea or some other cargo. This is the framing that parties, ideologies, and systems demanded that we keep separate. The party is a coalition. The ideology is a body of thought. The party can be evaluated by whether it advances the ideology, and that evaluation can change over time as the party's choices change. The ideology is evaluated by its internal coherence and its correspondence to the underlying moral reality it claims to describe. These are different evaluations. They use different standards. They are not interchangeable. Now, there are serious objections to the framing this episode has just laid out. They deserve to be heard before we close. The first is the realist case. It comes in two forms. In its first form, only the Libertarian Party can break the duopoly. And to preserve that institutional asset, the LP must broaden its tent, recruit candidates with crossover appeal, and pursue the largest possible vote share. To insist on doctrinal purity at the cost of electoral viability is to render the institutional asset useless. That has been the working theory of the Cato Institute and much of the Reason magazine network for 40 years. In its second form, third-party politics in a first-past-the-post system is structurally hopeless, and libertarian-aligned voters who care about advancing the agenda and actual policy must work within the Republican Party. Ron Paul reached more Americans with libertarian arguments through the Republican primary debates than the Libertarian Party has reached in aggregate across the entirety of its electoral history. That is the working theory of the broader Ron Paul movement and the Liberty Movement faction within the GOP itself. Both versions of the realist case are serious. They reach opposite tactical conclusions about the same political environment. The second objection is what we might call the philosophical purity as luxury case. It runs as follows. The doctrinaire libertarian position, the full anarcho-capitalist or strict minarchist application of first principles to every issue, is electorally unwinnable in any plausible American future. The perfect, on this view, is the enemy of the actual. By refusing to support a Republican candidate who would cut income tax by 20% on the ground that the candidate also supports the war on drugs, the doctrinaire libertarian forfeits the achievable cut for the sake of a doctrinal complete list no candidate will ever offer. These are real arguments. They are not silly. They are not arguments to be dismissed. The answer is not refutation. It is relocation. These are not arguments about whether libertarianism is true. They are arguments about strategy, about how libertarians, little l, given that the underlying philosophy is true, ought to behave in the political world they actually inhabit. Strategy is contestable. Strategic disagreement is internal to the tradition. What is not contestable, and what every one of these arguments implicitly concedes, is the underlying standard against which any strategic choice would be judged. That standard is whether the choice serves the libertarian idea, whether it advances liberty, reduces aggression, restrains the state, and respects the moral primacy of the individual. The realist who urges crossover candidates and the doctrinaire who refuses them are agreeing on the question. They disagree on the answer. The disagreement is honorable. It is the disagreement of allies who have read the same books and reached different conclusions about what the books require under present conditions. That is what this episode has been about. Putting the standard on the table. The standard does not change. The standard is the lowercase-l. Whatever institutional vehicle, whatever strategic posture, whatever tactical alliance is being weighed in the moment, the question to be asked is the same. Does this leave Americans more free or more governed? Does this advance the libertarian idea or some adjacent thing wearing its label? Does this honor the tradition that runs from Cicero through Locke, through Bastiat, through Rothbard, or does it use that tradition as cover for something the tradition would not recognize? Next week, the standard applied. The contemporary factions of the Libertarian Party measured against the foundations we have just laid out, and the specific test Grand Rapids will pose to each. And then the week after, the report from the floor. For now, the work is done. The standard is on the table. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been part one of a three-part feature on libertarianism and the 2026 Libertarian National Convention, the Adjective and the Noun, on the Consequential Actions podcast. The Empire Liberty series still continues on the network. It will conclude in its entirety with episodes 19 and 20 in the coming weeks. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com, where you'll find all written articles as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause, the New Leviathan, party systems and ideologies, and more. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes. Any subscription, like, and comments there on YouTube greatly helps out the cause. And follow me on X at @JKellick for updates, discussions, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until next time, have a great day.